Solitude is the place where silence speaks and the true self answers. Unknown author. Imagine this. It's late at night. No messages are coming in. No one is waiting for you. The world outside seems suspended, as if everything has stopped except your consciousness. And in the midst of the silence, something begins to emerge. It's not an answer. It's a presence. Yours. You are alone. Completely alone. But for the first time, this doesn't sound like a punishment. It sounds like an encounter. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid solitude. It's painted as failure, a sign of rejection, a symptom of inadequacy. In a hyper-connected world, being alone is almost a silent shame, as if the absence of stimulation were proof of irrelevance. But what if solitude isn't punishment, but a rite of passage? There is a type of solitude that isn't abandonment. It's purification. An isolation that doesn't isolate, but reveals. That doesn't push away, but reintegrates. The absence of the other in this context isn't emptiness. It's a mirror. Who are you and when no one is watching? This is the question that echoes when everything falls silent, when the mask has no audience, when words cease and only the sound of your own thoughts remains. It is then that the self begins to emerge, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. You may have felt this already, that strange peace within pain, that clarity that only appears when everything falls apart. The perception that, behind the daily hustle, there is something that has never ceased to be there, waiting to be seen. Nietzsche wrote that solitude is a school of spirituality, not in a religious sense, but as a path to the most intimate. Because only in solitude is it possible to hear what the crowd drowns out. Only in it can the soul speak without interruption. But not all solitude heals. There is the solitude of abandonment and the solitude of choice. The first wounds, the second transforms. Knowing how to distinguish between them is part of the journey. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable point. Transformation doesn't begin when someone welcomes you, but when you stop running from yourself. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming who you are. And this process, almost always, requires crossing inner deserts. Not because the desert is the destination, but because it is the path. The silence of solitude is where the ego screams and the self whispers. And here is the paradox. The more you refuse to be alone, the more distant you become from yourself. The more you move away from silence, the more noise you carry within. Solitude doesn't disconnect you. It reconnects you with the essential. Because solitude is not a flaw. It's a crevice, an invitation, a crack where the light enters. But it's frightening. And so we try to fill it with anything. Notifications, tasks, commitments, people. Everything becomes an excuse to avoid the abyss of being with oneself. But what if this abyss isn't the end, but the portal? The big question isn't how to avoid solitude, but who do you become when you choose to remain in it? This is what we are going to explore. Because perhaps instead of fleeing from solitude, it's time to traverse it and discover on the other side a new name for yourself. Solitude, in itself, is not the problem. The problem lies in how we've been conditioned to understand it. From an early age, we learn that being alone is being wrong. The hero is the one who leads. The admired is the one who is always surrounded. The successful one is the one who never lunches alone. And so we grow up fearing the void, not for itself, but for what it symbolizes: abandonment, failure, inadequacy. But what if this fear isn't genuine, but learned? Jung spoke of the fear of the psyche, the deep dread of looking within. And it is precisely in solitude that this dive becomes unavoidable. Without external voices, we hear our own. Without others' faces, we face the internal mirror. And therein lies the hidden problem. Solitude delivers us to ourselves, and we don't always like what we see. The modern individual is surrounded, yet absent, connected, yet lost. They live a tragic paradox, fearing solitude, but also fearing true intimacy, fleeing absence, but also encounter. Because what is really at stake is not the presence of the other, but the confrontation with one's own emptiness. Nietzsche stated that, "The man who cannot bear solitude cannot bear freedom." And perhaps that is why so many people trade autonomy for distraction. We prefer predictable noise to transformative silence. Solitude in this context becomes the frontier between the ego and the self, and crossing it requires courage. But we were not prepared for this. We were trained to respond, react, please, to fulfill functions, to never stop. Solitude threatens this programming. It takes us off script. It forces us to question, if no one is here, who am I now? And this is the root of the discomfort, the identity void. Without social roles, the character begins to crumble. And what remains? A silent presence that desires no applause, only truth. Solitude removes masks more forcefully than any criticism. It reveals the holes that performance tries to cover, and that is why it is so feared. Many confuse it with depression, others with failure. But it is not an illness. It is territory, a psychic space where something can finally be born. But like all births, it demands pain. Contemporary society tries to fill this space at all costs. Social media, productivity, constant entertainment. But the more we try to avoid solitude, the further we distance ourselves from ourselves. The soul withdraws. The body continues to operate, the mind fragments. Then a new form of solitude arises, being alone even among many. It is an invisible pain, but real. And perhaps, if you've made it this far, it's because you know this type of silence, the one that hurts more than noise, the one that isn't absence. It's excess internal noise, unspoken thoughts, repressed feelings. It is at this moment that the true journey begins. If this video is touching something in you, consider subscribing to the channel. There are other reflections like this waiting for you. Because recognizing the problem is the first step, but not the last. Solitude doesn't need to be cured. It needs to be understood, because it doesn't deny you life. It returns you to your origin. And if you have the courage to traverse it, you will find something there more valuable than companionship. You will find yourself. This denial of the inner call has silent and profound consequences. When we ignore solitude, it doesn't disappear, it disguises itself. And it begins to manifest as constant irritation, causeless fatigue, disconnection in relationships, insomnia that doesn't respond to medication. The body feels what the mind represses. The soul registers what the ego denies. Jung warned, "Everything that we do not face within ourselves we will encounter as fate." Ignoring solitude is often to condemn oneself to repeating cycles of shallow relationships, impulsive decisions, and an endless search for meaning outside oneself. The philosophical root of the problem is clear. We were trained to be useful, not to be whole. Solitude threatens this model because it dismantles us, and dismantling oneself is the first step to rebuilding with truth. But rebuilding hurts. It requires letting go of distraction. It requires saying no to autopilot. And above all, it requires enduring the discomfort of not having ready answers. And perhaps this is the forgotten beauty of solitude. It doesn't answer, it asks. And it is these questions that begin to redefine you. Solitude has a peculiar way of marking time, not by the days that pass, but by the versions of ourselves that it silences or transforms. It doesn't scream, it empties. And in the emptiness, something begins to reveal itself. Not what is missing, but what was hidden. It is in this space that the consequences begin to take shape. Slowly, discreetly, implacably. First, the loss of intimacy with oneself. The pain of unwelcomed solitude is not just emotional, it's identitary. You start to feel like a stranger in your own presence. Silences become uncomfortable, pauses seem eternal, and gradually, your own company becomes a burden. Then comes affective displacement. You relate, but with distance. You love, but with fear. You interact, but as if playing a role. Genuine connection requires presence, and without inner presence, any bond becomes a performance. You become accessible, but not available. You are there, but not whole. And there is also the most invisible side effect, the collapse of meaning. Without listening to yourself, you begin to live outwardly, for the demands of the world, for what is expected of you. And suddenly everything you do seems right, but nothing feels like yours. It's a type of internal exile. You are at the center of your own life, but you feel peripheral. This disconnection has physical consequences too. The body responds to the absence of meaning with symptoms: constant fatigue, anxiety, insomnia, a feeling of oppression in the chest, difficulty breathing deeply, as if something in you knows it is being neglected, silenced, set aside. And then comes the compulsion for fulfillment. Anything will do as long as there is no silence. Social media, series, alcohol, overworking, uncontrolled eating, everything is valid, as long as it keeps you away from the essential question: what is missing in here? This continuous escape generates a kind of emotional numbness. You begin to feel less, to desire less, to dream less. Not because there is nothing more to be lived, but because you are no longer present enough to feel what you are living. Solitude at this stage is no longer the absence of the other. It is the absence of self. But the paradox is that it also holds the way back. It is precisely in this collapse that something new begins to be born. When everything seems to fall apart, what remains is not ruin, it is space. And in this space, a question gains strength. What if I stopped running? This question is uncomfortable, destabilizing, but it also initiates healing, because true healing doesn't come from outside. It is born the moment you become capable of staying with yourself, even in pain. It is at this point that solitude ceases to be punishment and becomes a portal for the reconstruction of identity, for the rebirth of the soul, for reconnection with everything that was silenced. If you've been through something like this, feel free to share. Sometimes the comments are the echo of many who feel alone. Save this video. Maybe you'll need to hear this again another time. Because solitude, when respected, transforms. It becomes a space of rescue, fertile ground for a new inner truth, and above all, it becomes the beginning of a new form of presence, not social presence, but essential presence, the kind you don't need to show, only feel. And this presence, when it begins to manifest, changes everything. You start to realize that some pains didn't need healing, but a name. That some absences were blessings in disguise. That the void so feared was just the space where truth rested, waiting for courage. Your outlook changes. Relationships change. The way you move in the world changes. Solitude becomes a kind of inner home, a point of return, a space that demands no approval, no justification, only permission to be. And then you begin to relearn how to love, without fear of loss, without the expectation of completing the other. You love with presence, with listening, with truth, because you no longer need to be completed by another. You have already found yourself within yourself. The final consequence of traversed solitude is this: reintegration. You cease to be a fragment and become whole again. Not because everything was resolved, but because you stopped running. And by stopping, something in you could finally rest. And by resting, It began to live again. Liberation doesn't begin when solitude goes away. It begins when you stop fighting against it. It is in that instant of surrender, not of weakness, but of lucid surrender, that the silent rebellion begins. Rebellion against conditioning, against automatism, against the belief that being alone is a flaw. Solitude traversed with awareness is not a hole, it's a portal. But how does one cross the portal? The answer may seem simple, but it is profoundly revolutionary. By remaining in silence, remaining in absence, remaining in doubt, remaining in pain, not as a martyr, but as a witness to your own transition. Because something begins to dissolve when you stop resisting. The mask. And what emerges beneath it is not weakness, it's truth. Truth not in the absolute sense, but as internal experience, as contact, as presence. And this presence is the antidote to fragmentation. It is what begins to gather the pieces you scattered trying to be accepted, loved, understood. Rebellion, therefore, is choosing silence over distraction. It is sitting with oneself without warning, without expectation, and listening. Listening to what screams, what cries, what has been ignored for so long. Listening not to solve, but to welcome. Carl Jung said that what you need is where you least want to look. And that is precisely why solitude is so avoided. It pushes us towards this least wanting to look, towards this forbidden territory that holds traumas, shadows, memories, and also potential. Because where there is pain, there is buried truth. In this process, the creation of silent rituals becomes essential. Not as external routines, but as internal commitments. Moments of the day where the world doesn't enter. It could be a bath taken without hurry, a coffee drunk without a cell phone, a notebook where one doesn't write to post, but to exist. These small gestures become portals. They don't solve solitude, but they reteach us to be with it. And with that, they reteach us to be with ourselves. If this type of reflection accompanies you in moments of silence, consider becoming a channel member. For less than 8 Rs a month, you support this work and get access to exclusive content, made as refuges for those who have also chosen to awaken. Because this awakening doesn't happen all at once, it is made of flashes, of small truths that reveal themselves amidst tears, amidst silences, amidst days when you feel like you are falling apart. But, in reality, you are rebuilding yourself. This reconstruction demands a new internal vocabulary. Words we don't judge. Sensations we don't need to control. Emotions that, for the first time, can exist without being corrected. Rebellion is to stop arranging yourself on the inside to fit on the outside. It's allowing what emerges in solitude to have space, voice, body, even if it doesn't make sense yet, even if it hurts. Because there is pain that only hurts as long as it is denied. And gradually, you begin to notice. You are less anxious, less hungry for attention, less dependent on others to feel whole. Because the part of you that was waiting for rescue has been rescued by yourself, solitude then becomes companionship, a kind of internal wisdom that begins to guide you. You no longer run from yourself. You no longer need to fill every silence, because you have learned to hear what you previously avoided. And by hearing, you learn to see yourself. And it is in this seeing yourself, whole, imperfect, real, that liberation happens. Not as a grandiose event, but as a shift in axis. Life ceases to be a stage and becomes a path. You no longer need to perform, you can just walk. That's where emotional autonomy arises, the kind that doesn't reject the other, but doesn't depend on them to exist. You begin to relate by choice, not by necessity, by affinity, not by lack. And then something even more profound happens. The world begins to change color. What once seemed oppressive becomes secondary. What was once a priority dissolves, and what was once noise is now fertile silence. Because you have returned to listening to yourself, This is the essence of true rebellion, not against the world, but against everything you believed you needed to be in order to be loved. That is why so few choose it. And for that very reason, it is so transformative. In the end, you discover that solitude was never the enemy. It was the only one that remained faithful when everything else fell. It remained while the masks shattered, while the illusions unraveled. It was the one that stayed when the applause ceased, when familiar faces departed, when apparent meaning collapsed. And it is in this staying that it reveals its truth. Solitude is the guardian of reunion. Solitude didn't destroy you. It purified you. It removed what was excess. It silenced what was noise. It showed what was essential, even if by force. And then, in the emptiness, you found a presence you never imagined. Your own. Being with yourself ceased to be a sentence, but a state of power. You no longer depend on constant stimulation. You no longer need others' acceptance as a mirror of value, because you discovered an internal territory that demands no explanation, only respect. The final truth is not that solitude ends. It's that it changes roles, it ceases to be absence and becomes soil. Soil where creative silence is born. Original thought, authentic desire, legitimate emotion. Everything that was dormant, anesthetized, repressed, begins to return. And with that, you begin to live from a different place, a less anxious place, less conditioned, more intimate, more real. Nietzsche said that he who has a why can bear almost any how. Solitude reveals this why, and when it appears, everything changes proportion. The world is still there, others are still there, but now you are also there, and that is what changes everything. Being in yourself without fleeing redefines love, work, time, body, faith. Because all of this ceases to be a tool for affirmation and becomes an extension of your essence. This is the most powerful realization: to live without needing to hide, to exist without needing to defend yourself, to feel without apologizing. You didn't become stronger, you became more whole. And in this state of wholeness, life begins to pulse with another rhythm. Less urgency, more presence, less control, more listening. You begin to belong, not to a group, not to an idea, but to yourself. And then you understand, solitude wasn't about distance, it was about return. The most radical and silent return, the one in which, finally, you return to yourself. And upon returning, something changes permanently. You no longer sell yourself for any affection. You no longer mold yourself for any praise, because you know who you are, even when no one is watching. This knowing is not arrogance. It is root. It is center. It is home. And with it, everything becomes lighter. Even pain. Because now, even it has a place to rest. And perhaps in this very instant you have felt it. A different silence. Not that of emptiness, but that of reunion. And perhaps this is the beginning of a new way of living. One in which you walk with the world, without losing yourself. And this new way of living doesn't require great ruptures. It doesn't require you to abandon everything, to start from scratch, or to isolate yourself in the mountains. It begins in daily life. In the way you get up in the morning, in the way you breathe before responding, in the silence you choose to keep before reacting, in the pause you take between one task and another. Because now, you know, every small gesture can be a return to the center. This awareness also changes the way you look at others. By perceiving your own transformed solitude, you begin to see the hidden pain in others' eyes. No longer as weakness, but as sacred territory. You become more compassionate, more present. Not because you know everything, but because you learned not to flee. And this presence is the greatest gift you can offer. You no longer need to be heard at every moment, because you have learned to listen to yourself. You no longer need to prove what you feel, because what you feel is what anchors you. You no longer need to flee from yourself, and this makes you free in a way no one can take away. This is the rarest freedom, that of belonging to oneself. And with it, life ceases to be a race. It becomes a journey. It becomes dialogue. It becomes ritual. And everything that once seemed empty begins to have meaning again. Because now you know where you are, and you know who has returned with you. There are other reflections like this waiting for you.